A prophet is dropped into the middle of a valley, and the valley is full of bones. Not a grave, not a fresh battlefield. Bones that have been lying in the open so long they have gone completely dry. And then a voice asks him one impossible question. "Son of man, can these bones live?" That is not a horror film I am dressing up. That is the book of Ezekiel, chapter 37, almost word for word. One of the most famous images in the Bible, printed on posters, quoted at funerals. But almost nobody slows down to read what is on the page, and when you do, it stops being comforting and turns strange. The prophet is told to preach to a field of corpses. The bones start to move on their own. Flesh grows back over them while you watch, and then thousands of complete human bodies lie on the ground, whole in every way but one, perfect, and still dead. So the questions stack up. Who are these people, and what was missing from those finished bodies that new flesh could not give them? Is this a promise about the end of death itself, or about something that had already happened to an entire nation? Because once you trace where this vision comes from and the one Hebrew word it is built on, the Valley of Dry Bones turns out to be about something much closer to you than a desert miracle. Let's get into it. You have probably heard the phrase the Valley of Dry Bones without ever having read the passage it comes from. It gets quoted the way you quote a proverb, a nice line about hope, and then everyone moves on. So let's actually put it in front of you, slowly, because you cannot understand a mystery you have only ever heard summarized. It opens with a strange sentence. Ezekiel says the hand of the Lord was upon him, and he was brought out by the Spirit of the Lord and set down in the middle of a valley. Notice he does not say he walked there. He is carried, moved by something outside himself, and placed down in a specific spot. And the text says the valley was full of bones. Then it does something a rushed reading always skips. It says the Lord led him around and around, among the bones, all the way through them. Ezekiel does not get to see this field from a safe distance. He is walked through it, step by step, so that he cannot look away from a single detail. And two details come out of that walk, and both of them matter more than they look. First, the text says there were very many bones lying in the open valley. Very many. This is a whole population of the dead, not a handful. Second, and this is the one that should stop you, it says they were very dry. Sit on that word, dry. In the world of the Bible, that one word carries a whole story. Fresh death is one thing, but bones that have gone dry are bones that have been lying exposed for a very long time, picked clean, bleached, all moisture and life long gone out of them. Dry bones are the furthest possible point from living. They are not the recently dead who might be revived. They are the case everyone has already given up on. When the text says very dry, it is quietly telling you the situation is as hopeless as a situation can get. And there is something else buried in this image that a modern reader misses completely. But that would have hit an ancient Israelite like a punch. These bones are unburied. They are scattered in the open, out on the floor of the valley, exposed to the sun and the wind and the animals. And to the people Ezekiel was writing for, being left unburied was more than sad. It was the ultimate horror, the worst thing that could happen to a human being, because in that culture, a proper burial was everything. To be gathered to your fathers, laid in the ground, placed in the family tomb, that was the baseline of a life that had ended with dignity. And to be denied it, to have your body left out on open ground for the birds and the scavengers, was the mark of total defeat and total curse. It was what happened to an army that had been slaughtered and abandoned where it fell, with no one left to bury it. So this valley is anything but a neutral graveyard. It is a picture of catastrophe, what a battlefield looks like years after the losing side was wiped out, and nobody ever came back for the bodies. Now, into that scene, the voice speaks. And the question it asks is one of the strangest questions in all of Scripture. God turns to the prophet standing in this field of the long dead and says, "Son of man, can these bones live?" Think about how loaded that question is. Every natural instinct screams one answer: no, of course not. These are dry bones. This is over. This is the one condition from which there is no coming back. God is not asking Ezekiel about someone in a hospital bed. He is asking him about a valley full of skeletons that have been dead so long they have turned to chalk. The honest human answer is a flat, obvious no. But look at what Ezekiel actually says. He does not say no, and he does not say yes either. He gives one of the most careful, honest answers anyone gives to God anywhere in the Bible. He says, "O Lord God, you know." In other words, that is not my call to make. I know what my eyes are telling me. I know what is impossible, but I also know who is asking. So I'm not going to say no, because you are the one standing here asking me. Ezekiel refuses to close the door that his own eyes have already shut, and that answer is the hinge the whole vision turns on, because the next thing that happens is that God does not raise the bones himself, not directly. Instead, he gives Ezekiel an order that sounds almost cruel. He tells the prophet to prophesy, to preach, to stand in front of a field of corpses that cannot hear, cannot think, cannot respond, and speak to them out loud. Prophesy to these bones, and say to them, "O dry bones, hear the word of the Lord." Preach to bones. Command the dead to listen. It is one of the most absurd instructions imaginable, and God gives it with a completely straight face. And Ezekiel, to his credit, does it. He opens his mouth and starts speaking to skeletons. And that is where this passage stops being a poem about hope and turns into something that genuinely raises the hair on your arms. Because when he speaks, the bones answer. But before we get to what happens when a field of the dead starts to move, we have to answer the question sitting underneath all of it. Who put Ezekiel here? Who were these bones supposed to be? Because this vision did not come to a man in a comfortable life who needed a nice metaphor. It came to a man sitting in the wreckage of the worst thing that had ever happened to his people. And unless you know what that was, you will never feel why this valley looked exactly like their lives. To understand the valley, you have to meet the man standing in it, and you have to know where his body actually was when his mind was walking through those bones. Ezekiel was not a wild desert preacher. He was a priest. He came from the temple in Jerusalem, from the class of men whose whole identity was tied to that building, to the altar, to the presence of God in one specific city. And then, in a single generation, everything that defined him was torn away. Here is the history that sits under this vision, and it is brutal. The empire of Babylon, the great power of the age, came down on the little kingdom of Judah. And it did not happen all at once. It happened in waves, and each wave was worse than the last. In the first wave, the Babylonians took the young king and thousands of the leading citizens, the skilled, the educated, the priests, and marched them 1,000 miles east into exile. Ezekiel was in that group. He was dragged from Jerusalem and resettled in the flat foreign land of Babylon, beside an irrigation canal the text calls the river Chebar. Picture what that meant for a priest. His entire reason for existing was the temple, and now he was hundreds of miles from it, living in a refugee settlement in the heart of the empire that had crushed him, surrounded by people who worshipped other gods. And it is exactly there, sitting by that canal in a conquered people's exile, that the heavens open and Ezekiel starts to see things. Wheels within wheels, creatures with 4 faces, the glory of God moving on a throne. He becomes the strangest, most cinematic prophet in the whole Bible, and he becomes it in the least holy place imaginable, on unclean foreign soil, far from everything he thought God lived in. And notice what God calls him over and over all through the book. not Ezekiel. God addresses him again and again as Son of Man, in the Hebrew, Ben Adam. And that phrase is not a title of honor. It means something closer to son of dust, mortal, child of Adam, the one made from the ground. Almost 100 times God calls this prophet by a name that reminds him he is just a man made of earth, standing in front of the God of heaven. Hold on to that, son of dust, because in a few minutes it is going to collide with a field of human dust in a way that is not an accident. But the exile Ezekiel was living in was only the first blow, because back home Jerusalem was still standing, and the people left behind kept telling themselves it always would. God would never let his own city fall. The temple was untouchable. Any day now, the exiles would go home. And then came the second wave, and it broke them completely. The Babylonians came back, and this time they did not just take captives. They laid siege to Jerusalem, starved it, burned it to the ground, tore down the walls, and destroyed the temple. The house of God, the one fixed point in the universe for these people, was reduced to rubble and ash. And that is the moment you have to freeze on to understand the Valley of Bones. Because with the temple gone, something inside the people died that was bigger than any one person. Their king was captured, his sons killed in front of him, and then his own eyes put out so that the last thing he ever saw was the death of his line. Their nation was erased from the map. Their God, as far as the surrounding world was concerned, had lost. The exiles by the river were not just homesick. They believed in a deep and total way that they were finished. Not struggling, not down, finished. A people with no country, no temple, no king, and no future. And this is the detail that changes everything about the vision, and it is sitting right there in the same chapter, a few verses later, if you keep reading past the famous part. God tells Ezekiel exactly what the bones represent, in the people's own words. He says, "Son of man, these bones are the whole house of Israel." And then he quotes what they have been saying about themselves. They are saying, "Our bones are dried up, and our hope is lost, and we are cut off completely." Read that again and let it land, because it reframes the entire vision. The image of dry bones did not start with God, it started with them. The people had already been describing themselves that way. Our bones are dried up. We are as good as a field of skeletons. There is no coming back from what happened to us. They had looked at their situation, the burned temple, the lost king, the endless exile, and they had reached for the most hopeless picture a human being can imagine, a body reduced to dry bone, and they had said, "That is us." So when God carries Ezekiel out and drops him into a valley of very dry, unburied bones, he is not inventing a random horror scene. He is taking the exact metaphor his broken people had used to describe their own despair, and he is making the prophet stand inside it. He is saying, in effect, "You told me you were dry bones. All right, look, here is a whole valley of them. Now watch what I am about to do with the thing you were sure was over." And that is what makes the question hit so hard. Can these bones live? Underneath the skeletons in a desert, that question is aimed straight at the heart of every exile sitting by that canal who had already decided the answer was no. Can a nation this dead come back? Can hope this dry ever return? Can something that has already ended actually begin again? But knowing who the bones are only sharpens the mystery. It does not solve it. Because the how of what happens next is where this vision gets genuinely strange, and it all comes down to one single word that the English translations scatter into 3 or 4 different words, so that most readers never even notice it is the same word every time. Find that one word, and the whole valley suddenly clicks into place. There is one Hebrew word hiding underneath this entire vision, and once you see it, You cannot unsee it. The word is ruach. And ruach is one of the most important, most flexible words in the whole Hebrew Bible because it means three things at the same time. It means breath, the air in your lungs. It means wind, the air moving across the earth. And it means spirit, the invisible life that God breathes into things. Breath, wind, spirit, all one word. And here is what English does to you when you read this chapter. Your translation takes that single word, ruach, and scatters it into 3 or 4 different English words, depending on the sentence. So you read spirit in one line and breath in another and winds in another, and your brain files them as 3 separate ideas. But in the Hebrew, it is the same word, ringing like a bell over and over, all the way through the vision. 10 times in these 14 verses. The whole passage is a piece of music written on a single note, and most readers never hear it, because the English hands them 3 different notes instead of 1. So pay attention to this next part, because it explains the whole shape of what happens in the valley. The miracle does not come in 1 step, it comes in 2. And the reason it comes in 2 is that the vision is walking you deliberately through the 2 things it takes to make a dead thing live. Step 1. Ezekiel preaches to the bones like he was told. And the moment he speaks, there is a noise. The Hebrew word is one that means a rattling, a shaking, even an earthquake. A rattling runs across the whole valley, and the bones begin to move. Bone finds bone. A skeleton reassembles itself, joint fitting to joint, the whole field clattering as thousands of frames pull themselves back together out of the dust. And then it keeps going. Ezekiel watches as sinews appear on the bones, then muscle, then flesh, and finally skin stretches over the top and covers them. In front of his eyes, a valley of bare skeletons becomes a valley of complete human bodies, every part restored, every joint in place, every one of them whole. And then comes the line that should send a chill straight down your spine. The text stops and says, "But there was no ruach in them, no breath, no wind, no spirit. They were finished bodies, perfect and complete, lying in absolute stillness, whole, and not alive." Sit in that silence for a second, because it is one of the most haunting images in the Bible, and almost nobody notices it. You had bones. Now you have bodies. The transformation is staggering, and it is not enough. All that restoration, all that flesh and sinew and skin, and the valley is still a morgue, a more human-looking morgue, which is somehow worse. Because now the thing that is missing is impossible to ignore. The missing piece is life itself, ruach. So God gives Ezekiel a second command, and this is where the word does its most beautiful work. He tells the prophet to prophesy again, but this time not to the bones, this time prophesy to the ruach. And listen to the actual sentence, because it uses the word in 2 different senses in a single breath. Prophesy to the ruach and say, "Come from the 4 rushot, from the 4 winds, O ruach, O breath, and breathe upon these slain, that they may live." Do you see what just happened there? God does not simply say, "Let there be life." He tells the breath to come from the 4 winds, the 4 directions of the entire earth. The life about to enter these bodies is summoned from the whole world, called in from every corner of creation, north, south, east and west, and gathered into this one valley. The same word, ruach, is at once the breath that will fill their lungs and the 4 winds that carry it in. The wind of the whole earth becomes the breath of these particular dead, and it works. The text says the breath came into them, and they lived, and they stood up on their feet. In an instant, the whole valley goes from a field of silent corpses to a sea of living, standing, breathing people, thousands of them, rising all at once. And the passage gives them one final description that reframes everything that came before. It says they stood on their feet, an exceedingly great army. An army. Go back to the beginning of the vision and feel the reversal. It opened with the aftermath of a defeated army, the unburied slain of a people who lost, bones abandoned where they fell. And it ends with a victorious army, alive, standing on its feet, ready. The lowest possible image in that culture, the unburied dead, is turned all the way up into the highest, a living host. And the thing that carried them from one to the other was ruach, breath, wind, spirit. The one word the whole vision was built on from the first verse, when the ruach of the Lord first carried Ezekiel out and set him down among the bones. But this two-step miracle, bones into bodies and then bodies into living souls, follows a deliberate pattern. It is quietly echoing another story, the oldest one in the Bible. Ezekiel is not just watching people come back to life. He is watching the very first human being made all over again, in reverse of the very thing that killed them. And once you see which story this vision is quoting, the valley of dry bones stops being about death at all and starts being about undoing it. Go all the way back to the second chapter of the Bible, to the making of the first human being, and read how it is done. It says, "The Lord God formed the man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being." Read it slowly and count the steps, because there are exactly two. First, God forms a body out of the dust of the ground, a shape, a form, complete, but lying there lifeless. And then, second, God breathes into it, and only then does the dust become a living soul. Now hold that next to the valley, because it is the exact same two steps in the exact same order. Step 1. The bones and dust of the ground are assembled into complete bodies, formed, shaped, whole, and still lifeless. Step 2. The breath, the ruach, is called in, and only then do the bodies become living souls who stand on their feet. Ezekiel is not witnessing a one-off magic trick in a desert. He is watching the creation of Adam happen again on a mass scale in a valley full of the dead. The vision is quoting Genesis on purpose, beat for beat. And this is where that little detail from earlier comes roaring back. Remember what God kept calling Ezekiel, son of man, Ben Adam, son of dust, child of Adam, the one made from the ground. Now look at where God has placed this son of dust, standing in the middle of a valley of human dust, being told to speak life over it. The man made of earth is God's instrument for remaking men out of the earth. That is not a coincidence of translation. The vision has been quietly pointing at the creation of Adam since the very first time God opened his mouth and called the prophet son of dust. And here is why that matters so much. Think about what death actually was according to the very same early chapters of Genesis. When the first humans fall, the sentence God pronounces over them is this: "Dust you are, and to dust you shall return." That is the definition of death in the Bible. It is the body going back to the dust it was made from. It is the two steps of creation being run in reverse. The breath leaves, and then the form crumbles back into the ground. So look at what the Valley of Dry Bones really is. It is that curse being played backwards. Death took living people, pulled the breath out of them, and let their bodies collapse back into dry dust on the ground. And in the vision, God reaches into that finished, hopeless process, the dust that was the end of the story, and he reverses it. The dust gathers back into bodies. The breath comes back into the bodies. Return to dust becomes return from dust. The valley shows you more than God healing something. It is a picture of God undoing death itself, walking the oldest curse in the Bible in the opposite direction, step by step, in front of a single stunned prophet. And there is one more echo right at the beginning of the whole Bible that seals it. Genesis chapter 1, the second verse. Before there is any life anywhere, the earth is formless and empty and dark, and the text says the ruach of God, the Spirit of God, was hovering over the surface of the waters. The same word, ruach. At the very first creation, the Spirit of God moves over a dead, empty, chaotic world and brings order and life out of it. And now, in Ezekiel, that same ruach moves over a valley of chaos and death and does the same thing again. The wind that hovered over the waters at the beginning is the wind called in from the four corners of the earth to fill the lungs of the slain. It is the same Spirit doing the same work, bringing life where there was none. Quick pause here, right at the center of the whole video, because I want to say something to you directly. If you are the kind of person who would rather know what the text actually says in the original words than nod along to the flattened version everyone repeats, then subscribe. That is the entire reason this channel exists. Every week I take one passage people are sure they already understand or have quietly skipped over, and we go back to the oldest words and the deepest layers and read what is really there. Subscribe so the next one finds you, because in a few minutes I am going to show you the vision that comes right after this valley, and it is even stranger than the bones. It genuinely helps these deeper readings reach people who have only ever been handed the shallow version. All right, so here is where things get uncomfortable and important. Go back and stare at that terrible middle moment of the vision, the one almost everyone skips past on the way to the happy ending. The bodies are complete: bone, sinew, muscle, flesh, skin. Every single part is there, and they are dead. That image is in the text for a reason, and the reason is a warning you can feel in your own chest if you let it. Because it tells you that you can have the entire form of a thing and still be missing the life of it. You can rebuild every visible part, the structure, the skin, the shape that looks exactly like a living person from the outside, and none of it, not one piece, adds up to life on its own. The bones coming together was real progress, the flesh was real progress, and a valley full of perfectly reassembled bodies was still, until the breath came, just a quieter kind of graveyard. Restoration of the parts is not the same thing as the return of the ruach, and the vision refuses to let you confuse the two, which means the two-stage miracle is doing something sharper than just being dramatic. It is drawing a hard line between the outside and the inside, between having the shape of life and having the actual breath of it. And that line is about to matter enormously, because it is the key to the biggest argument there has ever been about this passage. For 2,000 years, people have looked at this valley and split into camps over one question. Was Ezekiel watching a picture, a symbol of a nation coming home? Or was he being shown ahead of time the literal raising of the dead at the end of the world? And the answer the text gives is stranger and bigger than either side usually admits. Let's start with what the text says outright, because unlike a lot of mysteries in the Bible, this one comes with its own built-in explanation. Keep reading past the famous vision, and God tells Ezekiel exactly what it means. He says these bones are the whole house of Israel, the people saying their hope is gone. And then he gives the interpretation in plain words. He says, I am going to open your graves and raise you up out of your graves, my people, and I will bring you back into the land of Israel, and I will put my ruach, my spirit, within you, and you shall live. So on the surface, the meaning is not hidden at all. The death in this vision is the exile. The dry bones are a shattered people who have lost their country, their temple, and their king, and who are convinced they are finished. And the resurrection is the promise that God is going to bring them home. He is going to reach into the grave of Babylon and pull his people out of it and plant them back in their own land. The Valley of Dry Bones, first and plainly, is a promise of national restoration to a people who thought they were a corpse. That is the meaning the text hands you directly, and any honest reading has to start there. And this is the part almost nobody connects, because it lives one chapter earlier, and if you only ever read the famous vision by itself, you will miss it completely. The promise God acts out in the valley was already spoken, in plain words, in the chapter right before it. In Ezekiel chapter 36, God makes his people a stunning offer. He says he will take out of them their heart of stone and give them a heart of flesh instead, a living heart in place of a dead one. And then he says the line that ties everything together: I will put my ruach, my spirit, within you, and you will live, and I will bring you back to your own land. So look at what chapter 37 really is. Far from a random horror scene God improvises, it is the promise of chapter 36 turned into a picture you cannot forget. The heart of stone is the valley of dry bones. The heart of flesh is the flesh growing back over them. And the spirit put within you, that exact promise, is the ruach called in from the four winds to make them stand. The vision is the sermon of the chapter before it, acted out in a field of the dead. God said it in words. Then he made his prophet watch it happen. And that is why the same word, ruach, runs through both chapters like a thread pulling them into one. But notice something, because this is where it gets interesting. Watch how the image shifts. In the vision itself, the scene was a valley of bones lying out in the open. But in the explanation, God changes the picture. Suddenly, he is talking about graves, about opening graves and raising people out of them. He did not have to reach for that image. If all he meant was a nation coming back from exile, he could have used a dozen gentler pictures. Instead, he chose the single most literal image of resurrection there is: opening the grave, raising the dead body out of the ground. He deliberately turned the dial from a battlefield of bones all the way up to the opening of tombs. And that choice is the crack that the biggest argument in the history of this passage pours through. Because for 2,000 years, readers have looked at that language and asked an obvious question. If this is only a symbol of a nation coming home, why is it dressed in the imagery of literally raising the dead? And there have been roughly 4 honest ways to answer that, and I am going to lay them out fairly, because you deserve to see the options rather than be handed one and told it is settled. The first reading keeps it strictly to the plain context. On this view, the whole thing is a metaphor and nothing more. The bones are the nation, the resurrection is the return from exile, and God is simply using the most dramatic image available to comfort people who felt as dead as a nation can feel. The point lands somewhere simpler than the afterlife. No situation, not even one that looks like a valley of dry bones, is beyond God's power to reverse. This is the meaning rooted most firmly in Ezekiel's own moment, and it is almost certainly the first thing his original audience heard. The second reading says the imagery is doing more than the metaphor strictly needs, and that this is on purpose. On this view, Ezekiel's valley is one of the places in the Hebrew Bible where the hope of an actual bodily resurrection of the dead is beginning to take shape. Because think about it. For God to use resurrection as a comforting picture, his audience already had to be able to imagine resurrection as something real and good. The metaphor only works if the thing behind it means something. So many readers, both Jewish and Christian, have seen this chapter, alongside a few others like the promise in Daniel that many who sleep in the dust will awake, as an early seedbed of the belief that one day God will actually raise the dead, not just the nation, the people, bodily, for real. Those first 2 readings both look outward at history and doctrine. The next 2 turn the vision around and aim it straight at you. The third reading refuses to choose and argues that the passage is deliberately layered. On this view, the near meaning is the return from exile, exactly as the text says, and the deeper meaning, planted underneath it, points forward to the resurrection of the dead at the end of all things. The exile and the homecoming are the foreground. The defeat of death itself is the shadow it casts. On this reading, God is answering the exile's despair and, at the same time, quietly making a promise that reaches far past their generation to everyone who has ever stood at a graveside. But the fourth reading is the one that refuses to let you stay a spectator. It takes the whole thing personal and inward, reading the valley as a picture of spiritual deadness in any human being, in any age. The dry bones are a person who has given up, gone cold, lost their hope, gone through the motions with no life in them. And the promise is that the same ruach that filled the valley can breathe life back into a person the world, or they themselves, had already written off. On this reading, the vision is not only about a nation or the end of the world. It is about you, right now, and whatever part of you has quietly turned to dry bone. Now here is a piece most people have never heard, and it shows you how seriously the oldest readers took this. There is an ancient Jewish tradition, preserved in the Talmud, that argues over whether the Valley of Dry Bones was not a vision at all, but an event. A thing that literally, physically happened. Some of the ancient rabbis held that Ezekiel really did stand in a real valley, and that real dead people really rose, stood up, and lived. There are even old traditions that tried to identify who they were, and stories that these revived people went on to walk to the land of Israel, marry, and have children. One teacher in the Talmud even claimed to be descended from them. Now, I have to be completely straight with you here, the way this channel always tries to be. That Talmudic material is ancient Jewish tradition and debate. It is not part of the biblical text itself, and I am not putting it on the same shelf as the book of Ezekiel. Other rabbis in that very same discussion insisted the whole thing was a parable, a mashal, and never physically occurred. So even the ancient teachers did not agree. But the fact that they argued about it so intensely tells you something important. They did not treat this vision as a throwaway poem. They treated it as touching the single biggest question a human being can ask. Can the dead actually live again? And they took that question seriously enough to fight over it for centuries. And there is one more detail that shows how deep this chapter runs in Jewish life, and it is beautiful. To this day, the vision of the dry bones is the passage read aloud in the synagogue during Passover, the festival of redemption, the season of coming out of slavery and death into freedom and life. Of all the times in the year to read a valley of bones standing up into an army, they chose the feast that celebrates a whole people being brought out of the grave of Egypt. The dry bones and the Exodus, read together, both saying the same thing. What looked like the end was not the end. So the meaning of the valley is not one thing. It is a nation promised it will come home, and a people promised that death itself does not get the last word, and a single soul promised that dry is never the same as done. But underneath all four of those readings, there is one question the vision keeps forcing back on you, and it is the most personal one of all. Because if God can raise a whole valley with a word, then the strangest part of this entire story is the thing he does first. He does not just speak and raise them, he makes a man do it. And the reason why turns the whole vision around to face you. Come back to the strangest instruction in the whole vision. God, who could raise this entire valley with a single unspoken thought, instead turns to a tired exile and says, "You do it, you prophesy, you speak to the bones." Why? Why root the power of life through the voice of a man made of dust, telling him to preach to an audience that has no ears, no minds, no way on earth to respond? It would be like ordering someone to read a speech to a cemetery. And yet that is exactly, deliberately, what God does. And the answer to why is one of the quiet keys to the entire Bible. God chooses, again and again, to bring his life into the world through the word he gives to human beings to speak. The bones do not rise when Ezekiel has a private feeling about them. They rise when he opens his mouth and speaks the word he was given, out loud, over a situation that looked utterly beyond it. The prophet is not the source of the power. He does not have life in him to give, but he is the channel God insists on using. The word of God, spoken by a human voice into a hopeless place, is the thing the ruach travels along. And look again at the two things Ezekiel is told to speak to, because together they are a complete picture. First, he speaks to the bones. That is the message, the preaching, the word declared over the dead situation. And it does something real. It assembles them, gives them shape, brings them together, covers them in flesh. But you already know how that stage ends, with a valley of perfect, complete, lifeless bodies, because the word declared over the situation on its own is not enough. So then he is told to speak to the ruach, to call, almost like a prayer, for the Spirit to come from the four winds and breathe. And only when both happen, the word spoken to the bones and the Spirit called into the bodies, does the valley actually live. That is the whole vision compressed into a method. You can have the word without the Spirit, and you get a valley of corpses that look right and do nothing, structure with no life. And the vision will not let you settle for that. It insists on both, the declared word and the living breath, the shape and the ruach, before it calls anything alive. And somehow, God has decided that a human being, standing there speaking in faith over something that looks finished, is part of how both of them arrive. But here is the turn, and it is the reason this vision has never stopped mattering. Go back one more time to what the people actually said about themselves, in their own words. Our bones are dried up, our hope is lost, we are cut off. Read that not as ancient history, but as a sentence a human being says, because who among us has never said some version of it? Our bones are dried up, the part of me that used to be alive has gone dry. Our hope is lost, I stopped believing this could change. We are cut off, whatever I had, that connection, that calling, that person, it is gone, and it is not coming back. That is not just the language of a defeated nation. It is the language of a human being at the end of themselves. And that is what makes the valley a mirror instead of a window. It is easy to read this as a story about people far away and long ago, a nation in exile 26 centuries back. But the vision keeps aiming past them at whoever is listening. Because everyone has a valley. Everyone has some field of dry bones inside them, some situation, some relationship, some hope that they have already walked through and quietly concluded is over. Very many, and very dry. And into that exact place, the vision drops the same impossible question God asked the prophet. Can these bones live? And notice, the vision does not let you answer that question the way your eyes want to. Your eyes say no, dry bones do not live. That is the obvious, sensible human answer, and it is exactly the answer the exiles had already given. But watch what the one honest man in the story says when God asks him. He does not say no. He also does not force out a fake, cheerful yes. He says, "O Lord God, you know." He refuses to slam a door that God has his hand on. He holds the situation open and hands the verdict back to the only one who actually gets to decide it. Because that is the whole point the vision has been building toward. The bones cannot raise themselves. The prophet cannot manufacture a single breath. The life comes from outside the valley entirely. It is summoned in from the four winds, from beyond, from God, and given. And that is either the most hopeless fact in the story or the most hopeful one, depending entirely on which direction you read it. If life had to come from inside the valley, the bones would have stayed bones forever. But it does not. It comes from the God who stands over the valley asking the question, which means the dryness was never the final word. The final word belonged to the one holding the breath. Which brings us all the way back around to a prophet standing alone at the edge of a field of the dead, being asked the one question none of us can answer on our own. We started with a picture that sounds like something out of a nightmare. A man dropped into a valley of the long dead, ordered to preach to bones, watching corpses stand back up into an army, and the version most people carry, if they know it at all, is that it is just a nice line about hope, best left as a poster on a wall. But when you actually slow down and trace the words, it turns into one of the most carefully built passages in the entire Bible. The very dry bones told us how hopeless it was meant to look, the worst image a defeated people could reach for. The exile told us who they were, a nation that had already called itself a corpse. The word ruach told us how the miracle worked, breath and wind and spirit, one word doing everything, life summoned from the four winds into a valley of the dead. The echo of Genesis told us what God was really doing, running the oldest curse in the Bible backwards, remaking humanity out of the dust. And the reason a man had to speak it told us the part that turns the whole vision around to face us. The dryness is never the final word. The final word belongs to the one who holds the breath. That is the whole reason this channel exists. To open the book back up and read what is actually on the page, even when the truth turns out to be stranger or heavier or more hopeful than the version we were handed. So here is the question worth sitting with. If the most hopeless thing in the vision, a valley of dry bones, was one word away from becoming a living army, then the real mystery of Ezekiel was never whether the dead can come back. It was who is standing over your valley and what he is waiting to hear you say. And that makes you wonder what God does with an army he just raised from nothing. Because the very next thing Ezekiel is told to do is take 2 dead sticks, one for Judah and one for Joseph, and watch them become one living kingdom in his hand. If this changed how you see even one passage, subscribe, because next we follow this same prophet straight into the vision that comes right after the bones. 2 sticks, 2 broken kingdoms, and a promise about a shepherd, a temple, and a name for the city that will make the hair on your arms stand up. And the video on screen right now goes back to the beginning of Ezekiel, to the wheels within wheels, and the throne he saw by the river. The vision so strange people have argued about it for 2,000 years. Go ahead and click it. I think you will want to know what he actually saw.